Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, and welcome back to what is very confusing because it is actually the last day of 2024. I just thought I'd publish the last Karma Koala podcast for 2024. I was going to start on 2025, but of course, I didn't write anything in my old-fashioned diary and almost missed Adam in Oaxaca in Mexico, who is a writer on psychedelics, but also does something really interesting, which is content marketing on psychedelics, which I think he's probably, as far as I'm aware, the only person on the planet who does that. So I thought, oh no, why not get him on the world's most under-listened cannabis and psychedelics podcast to talk about that. Adam, welcome to the show, and thank you for being very patient with my bad scheduling at the end of the year.
Thank you, Sean. Pleasure to virtually meet you, and thanks for having me on.
I think we came across each other on LinkedIn, and I saw initially that you do content marketing in psychedelics, but maybe a little bit of background about yourself and how you got there.
Sure. That could be a long story. I'll try and be economic with it. I'm originally from Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. I haven't lived there in 20 years. After that, I've lived in Spain, Florida, Texas, Tennessee, and now I live in Mexico. I've been doing marketing, digital marketing for most of my life. About 15 years ago, I started getting into content marketing, and I got into content marketing in the psychedelics field by way of synchronicity. It was by random design. It was 2020. I was coming off my second ayahuasca retreat, and I was integrating, and it was within the first week after the retreat ended, and a person found me on LinkedIn, reached out, and we connected, and then boom, I found myself creating content in the psychedelics field. It was not planned. I was not looking to do it.
That's always the best way. That's always the best way.
Yes, it is. It's a curious thing about psychedelics. I always bring up a favorite quote of mine by the famous American writer Hunter S. Thompson. He wrote once, I believe, in a letter to his friend, and he said that you don't find LSD, LSD finds you. And this is very true of psychedelics, whether you're under the influence or not. You know, there is a mysterious way that they work, and it seems that they found me and wanted me to be working in this
No, well,
field,
I mean, for me, you know, my psychedelics days are for use are very rare these days. A lot in my sort of 20s and early 30s, but really, in terms of the thinking, it really took the mind 15 years or 20 years to really work out what they were telling me. You know, and I'm like you. When I started this, I just happened to be in Portland, Oregon, in 2015 when cannabis suddenly started going legal, and I'd been in the exciting business of legal publishing for 30 years. I thought, how can you make legal publishing slightly less dull? Let's start dealing and talking about these issues when nobody else was. So similar sort of path. I'm really interested in the content marketing of psychedelics because there's, you know, I'm a legal podcaster. There must be lots of issues about compliance, legality. Where does this information get placed? Who are the type of people or companies trying to place information, and what's their aim if they're not trying to sell stuff?
Okay, that's a pretty big question, but let's see if we can break that down a little bit. Basically, any company that is smart about their marketing is going to want to be doing content marketing, because content marketing is anything from writing blogs, doing newsletters. It could be video content. It can be emails. It can be all kinds of different things. So companies need to get their message out there. And then the next biggest thing with psychedelics is that even though people might call this a psychedelic renaissance, I would call it a psychedelic revival. There's still a ton of education needed, a ton of education needed.
Well, 99.9% of education needed, I think, is where we're at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, recently I saw that, I don't know, maybe last year or 2 years ago, 8 million Americans had used psychedelics, which is a large number, but comparatively to the 330 or 340 million living in the United States, still a pretty small figure per capita. So there's a ton of education needed. So that's what comes in to content marketing, is the need for education. And then in terms of compliance, I can't say much about that. I do have one little insight. Uh, Obviously it's not regulated or anything. Pretty much anybody can put any kind of content they want out on the internet, but there are going to be questions about trust, and that's important, in virtually any industry, but especially in psychedelics, when you're talking about mental health, psychic health, and people poking around under the hood of their mind, body, and spirit. So something that I have seen in recent times when it comes to content in this space is that maybe somebody like me, I don't have any qualifications. I'm not a therapist. I didn't go to college for mental health or therapy or anything of that sort. But say somebody like me writes something for a company, and then sometimes now companies, what they're doing is having what's written reviewed by a therapist or a doctor or something like that. And then it will say on that article, reviewed by Dr. So and so, and then, give their credentials.
Are you writing mainly for US based companies, or are there other organizations around the world that you're also writing for?
There are some organizations I write for in other parts of the world. One of the first companies I worked with was in Canada, and I do work with a company in the cannabis space in England. So there are companies around the world. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that there's two sides of the psychedelic business spectrum, I guess you could say. There's the therapy side, and then there's what I call the retreat side. And there are two very different approaches, maybe to the same goal. Where there's going to be companies working on this really depends on a lot of the legality. So right now, in terms of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, that doesn't have a lot of legality across the world right now yet. Whereas the retreat side of things, there's retreats, at least in a dozen countries, probably closer to 24 countries around the
I
world.
mean, a perfect example is Jamaica. It seems to be,
Yeah.
as far as I can work out, is full of retreats.
Yeah. There's a pretty big one there, which is Beckley. Beckley Retreats is in Jamaica.
Are they in Jamaica? Are they? Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, Jamaica and the Netherlands, I believe.
And so, in terms of when you're writing in a jurisdiction like Jamaica, it's basically your client who will check with third parties whether what you're saying or what you and they are saying together is correct, because nothing is correct, obviously. I mean, this is why I'm interested, because with writing you have to be quite very specific, but with writing and psychedelics there's a lot more fuzzy, well, it's all fuzzy area to talk about. I mean, you mentioned Hunter S. Thompson, so we've all, I presume you've read Huxley, you've read Kesey, you've read all these 20th century writers who for me are the Bible on these issues, and at the moment I feel that not enough people in the 21st century are paying attention to what 20th century writers wrote and understood about psychedelics, and we've got more of this sort of pop culture pollen type approach, which I don't think is actually as intellectually got the same strictures as those 20th century writers had. And I'm trying to understand where and how people are pulling their knowledge from. Is it, when you're dealing with a corporate client, is it they're really only interested in scientific writing, or are they also interested in that knowledge writing from the 20th century and the late 19th century?
Okay, so that's a great question. That's right up my alley too, because I've read most of those guys, and I'm Generation X. So when I was young, those were the legends of psychedelic, myth.
Exactly
and
mine. I
lore.
mean, in your 20s, that's what you read.
yeah. And
If you could
that's where
find
I
it, because
learned.
some of it was quite hard to find at the time as well.
Yeah. And that's where I learned a lot about psychedelics was through those writers. And like you said, a lot of their wisdom and insights now have, just outside of psychedelic circles have been largely forgotten, I think. And there's still a lot of wisdom
And
there.
and and, and anything that is remembered has been distilled down to the lowest common denominator
Yeah,
and 21st century pop cultured in really short bites in, we're
yeah,
talking X
yeah,
stroke TikTok approach, which I find, with psychedelics, it's going to be quite a dangerous thing if we start going down that road, because Huxley wrote about that, exactly what happens when you do that. And it
yes.
seems to me that a lot of the people involved in the psychedelics industry are either aren't aware of that, or if they are, they're pushing that to the side because capitalism trumps learning.
Okay, yeah. So there's a million different directions I can go in with this. Uh,
But this is psychedelic, so that's why we have to have that discussion, because
uh,
it because it can go a million different ways, can't it?
right. Let me try and slow down my brain because I have all these answers filling my head in at once. I have not run into many issues with companies kind of, I don't want to call it fact checking, but checking the quality of what I write. Because one of the important things to remember now is even though there's a lot of science coming out now to back up psychedelics in various ways, science only goes so far. And that's one of the big themes of psychedelics is that the science has not maybe caught up with a lot of these things. And maybe it won't ever be able to catch up with these things because we're living in an era when there's cracks in the foundation of rational materialism. And we're maybe learning and realizing that that is only a narrow bandwidth of our consciousness and that our five senses can't maybe detect or sense or experience the full spectrum of consciousness. So I think those were some of the things that the Keseys, the Huxleys, the Thompsons, were talking about and writing about outside of that scope of science. I just was watching a video of Terence McKenna. I mean, you could spend your rest of your life watching all his videos and reading his books. And he was talking in a video in the 1990s about trauma and basically psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, which I found fascinating because I didn't know that before. And this was long before it became anything close to popular or researched again. There were some people working on it on the time, maybe like Stanislav Grof and people like that, and Rick Doblin. But I mean, for Terence McKenna to be talking about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in the 90s, that was really mind blowing to me. But to your other point is, yeah, there's questions. There's a lot of questions in the psychedelics field about whether this should go mainstream or whether it should stay underground. I've met a lot of people who would prefer that it stays underground, and I understand that. I don't think anyone can control what happens now. The genie's out of the bottle. We'll see what happens. But obviously, this opens up, a whole can of worms in Pandora's box, if you will, about people kind of just jumping on the bandwagon because it's a psychedelic
that's
gold
because the
rush.
interesting thing is, of course, the narrative from those in power is that if something is underground or black market, it's not managed properly and it's bad for people's health in really simple terms. But of course, with psychedelics, the majority of people who have been involved in psychedelics, the production of, the distribution of, the explanation of over the last, let's call it 55, 60 years, it have been fairly responsible. And I would suggest they're actually looking at the way that the market, I'm doing inverted commas because we're on video, but this is an audio podcast, is will actually not have that same discipline. That's my main worry.
Yeah, it's a possibility. It's a definite possibility. Things could go wrong in this psychedelic gold rush because people are rushing um, to catch the money bags. Maybe
Well, it's you
I don't
just
know
said it,
who.
gold rush, just like cannabis. It's the dollar sign becomes before anything else, and that
Yeah, and it's
that never
difficult to
solves the
say
problem,
because
does it?
Yeah, because people in the underground, will say that people working in this space are sellouts or whatever. And, I run across people who are maybe like, 40 or 50, and they just did their first journey or had their first psychedelic experience within the last couple of years. And, that might be great. That might be awesome for their health and for them personally. But then, now they're working in the psychedelic space. And it just makes me wonder
Well, people with
sometimes.
capital who have recently taken psychedelics for the first time, I find it quite dangerous, I think.
Well, yeah, and the other interesting thought is this: is I've had this discussion a few times. Is fingers crossed. I hope that maybe psychedelics are so wild and unpredictable and cosmic that maybe they'll be a Trojan horse.
In what way do you mean that?
Well, in the aspect that there's this concern, which is a legitimate and valid concern, that psychedelics can be co-opted by capitalism. And I think this is the main concern of people in the underground, that they don't want psychedelics to be co-opted by capitalism, and become a new market to be monetized, and for money to be made off of that. So maybe, too often as humans, we just don't like to think, and we like to make everything easy. So we break things down into binaries, yes and no, black and white, which is not a very healthy way to think. So I always try and think in terms of yes and. Why can't it be both? Why can't it be black and white at the same time? And so maybe,
Which is, of course, what
while
psychedelics
psychedelics
teach.
go,
It teaches you. It can be black,
it's
white,
yeah, that should
grey,
be one of
and
the
all
main
the other
like
colors in
esoteric
between at the
teachings of
same time.
psychedelics, is that
Yeah.
dark and light need each other to coexist at the same time. One doesn't rule out the other. So maybe this is like the consciousness of psychedelics doing this, is that it's going mainstream because it can't be co-opted. Maybe it will be for a short time, but in the long term, maybe it'll be something that has some huge benevolent effect. We don't know. And another teaching that follows on the heels of this that I always talk about, that's helped me, with life, that I've learned through psychedelics, is I always say that shit grows flowers, which is literally and figuratively true. It's very there's a great Zen, or no, Taoist, excuse me, Taoist parable about this, about an old man who gets a horse as a gift, and he's careful not to get too excited and enthusiastic and happy about getting the horse, because he says, just wait and we'll see what happens next. And I think the next part of this story is his son rides the horse and falls off and breaks his leg. And then all his neighbors are like, oh, what a horrible, horrible thing. He's like, no, it's okay. We'll just see what happens next. And then I think the next thing that happens is there's an army that comes through town and tries to recruit his son for the army, but his son can't go because he's got a
It's got a
broken leg.
broken leg, yeah.
So life is a continual cycle of bad things and good things happening one after the other. So, this might look bad now for psychedelics in terms of capitalism and being co-opted, but who knows? 10, 15, 20 years down the road, maybe we look back and say that was the best thing that could ever happen.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point you make, because I've spoken with a few licensed therapists in Oregon, and the level of intellectual curiosity, knowledge, and almost an approach as though they'd been classically trained, was very strong in these people. And it's the first, except for Colorado. Well, it's the first before Colorado. So there might be problems with the way that the structure of the psychedelic treatment setup has come out of central government, but the people that they're giving it to, actually, I have a lot more trust, having spoken to them, than I did in the creation of that. And being Oregon, of course, it's quite a sensible system. It's everything is pretty balanced, because they got that balance between old school conservatism and forward thinking, which is why obviously a lot of psychedelic thinking came out of Oregon in the 60s and 70s. So it's funny, I agree with you totally, because I think that if you allow the people who are serious about psychedelics to be involved in it and make decisions, it seems to have, it's always going to be a rather sort of all over the place path, because you don't know where the path's going to lead you. But I have more trust in those people than I have in a lot of people I talk to about cannabis.
Yeah. Fingers crossed. We'll see what happens. And Oregon's an interesting place to talk about because I wrote an article, I don't know, a year or two ago about Oregon, and uh, they legalized psilocybin there a few years ago, and it went into effect like a year or two ago. And then I think maybe right before it went into effect, half the state basically pulled out of that agreement. And it was very interesting because it was the eastern part of Oregon that said, no, we don't want this, even though it was already approved. And basically, what it came down to, like many things in the United States nowadays, it became a rural versus urban thing.
Yeah,
And
well,
I
well,
watched
they
some,
call, having been a Portland resident for a while, it's the I-95 corridor goes
yeah,
yay, everybody else goes nay.
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing is that I watched some of the interviews of the people, the rural Oregonians living in Eastern Oregon, and it basically just all boiled down to an education issue. People just still need to be educated on this because those ghosts of the past from the 60s are still haunting us today. There's still a bit of a stigma around psychedelics, and people are still lacking education to a great extent. And so that will prevail in urban areas. So that's why there's still a huge need for education.
And how do you feel about, Colorado's about to kick their program into go as of tomorrow, really, I think, or the first week of January. They seem to have taken a pretty similar approach to Oregon. Are you feeling pretty confident about what they're doing?
Again, I'm just going to say fingers crossed. I mean, we're entering new territories and new waters with all of this. So it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds and it rolls out because there's going to be mistakes that are made. This is not going to be perfect. And Colorado is kind of the tip of the spear, leading the charge of all this. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens because I think places like Portland, Colorado, and Austin now arguably have higher psychedelic profiles than San Francisco. San Francisco is always going to be big. They're always going to carry the traditional psychedelic, banner. I think Portland, Denver, Austin have caught up with San Francisco, if not passed it. So what happens in Colorado is going to be very important.
So, I mean, let's get back to the beginning of the conversation, which is all about communication, words, and psychedelics. Um, what do you think, as these programs grow around the country, what's the best way to try and create some sort of standards within psychedelics communication using language? Do you think more educational institutions, especially tertiary ones, should get involved in these conversations? You've got Petrie, Flom at Harvard, but they're more scientific. I don't see much. I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to say is I don't see much. There's imagine a few literature courses around the country which will touch on these things as part of 20th century literature or 20th century communication, but I don't see really any sort of structured programs trying to work out or starting to show some sort of investigation into how we use language with regard to these compounds becoming part of daily culture.
That's a great question, and I don't have any solid answers for that, but I do have an idea. I think that uh, we're living in an era now where people are realizing that a lot of our institutions have cracks in the foundation and are failing us. And one of the popular responses to that is the idea of decentralization. So I think in terms of language, it's very important for the people to create the language. And I mean, that's part of culture. And culture never comes from the top down. Culture grows from the bottom and then moves upward. So I think it's very important for the people themselves to create that language in their own communities, in their own schools, in their own public spaces. And one example of the importance of language, I've just been working on an article, and somebody brought to my attention that not everybody uses the word psychedelic across the world. Not only that, but a lot of people you speak to, and if you use that word, they don't even know what it means because these people are indigenous and that word doesn't exist in their language. And I've run into this firsthand in Mexico. speaking with some people here, I'll say psychedelic to them in Spanish, and they don't know what it means because this word was only created in 1956 by Humphrey Osmond. So that word is a creation of the West. And I found an interesting article recently on BBC kind of talking about this subject, and has the article proposed an alternative phrase or term, which is spirit medicine. And I love that because that's speaking the language of indigenous people. When you say spirit medicine to them, they're going to immediately know what that means as opposed to psychedelic. And, spirit medicine, I don't think, I mean, maybe, I'm not sure, but I would assume that's probably something that came out of those indigenous cultures in communities and people rather than from some institution or, think tank up at the top. So I think it's important for that language to be developed, created, nurtured, cultivated by the people.
And then just formalized through using current technology, and a lot of this is just going to be online, and people will have hopefully reliable resources to understand information, because again, most of this stuff's fairly academic at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, there is. It's heavily shrouded in academia, and that is an issue I have. I know that world a bit. I have a master's degree. I have a thesis. So I spent 10 years in college. I know how all that goes. And that's one of the themes that I push and talk about. I just posted something about this on LinkedIn recently because there was an Economist article that came out just, I think it was like last week or 2 weeks ago, talking about how academic writing has become too difficult to read. The level of writing in academic journals.
No, I'm a literature grad, and 3 paragraphs in academic writing these days.
Yeah,
Well, because
yeah,
because most of the people who write in academic writing prior had classical education, so they could structure a decent argument. Now they don't. So a lot of time it just seems like a word salad to me.
yeah, and not only that, but when people work in academia for so long, you get that academic style of writing just ingrained into your brain, and it's very difficult for people to downshift and to write in a different style that's more digestible and more palatable for the masses. The average reading level in the United States is like 6th or 7th grade, and this has been true for decades. And I think it's probably getting worse because the reading level in the United States is not very good because our education system is poor. And so this begs a question. The last time I looked, there's 200 million people with trauma in the United States. And if these people want healing for trauma, they're going to need to understand the process behind psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. But if they can't read or understand journal articles because it's not speaking their language, then we have a real bad disconnect here.
So as we're literally about to go into 2025, what are your hopes for the type of work that you do? If I was speaking to you in 12 months' time, what do you hope that you might have achieved, or some of the companies that you're working with might have achieved in what is going to be the roller coaster year of the century so far? In my poor political opinion, I think we're in for something pretty full on this year. So adding psychedelics into that mix is going to make it very interesting. Yes,
I totally agree with that, Sean. Yeah, we're in for a wild ride. I was just writing an article about basically a 2024 year in review, a very weird year. But we can talk more about that later because there's a nice little Terence McKenna tie-in with novelty theory. But I just hope that this psychedelic revival, if you were speaking with me a year from now, I was able to help make some headway into making it more accessible for the masses in terms of